That summer, Alex and I lived in the woods. It was the 80s. No cell phones, no internet, no worries from our parents as long as we were back before dark. We had thousands of acres of forest behind our neighborhood, thick with trees, hills, and rocky outcroppings. No matter how far we went, we never seemed to reach the end. It was a world of our own, a place where we could do anything. We spent every day out there. We'd wake up early, pack sandwiches, grab our knives, and disappear into the trees. We built forts, played war games, and tested out survival gear my dad would take us to buy at the army surplus store. We even convinced our parents to let us camp out sometimes, as long as we stayed close enough for my dad to help us set up. It was the kind of childhood that doesn't exist anymore, just two kids running wild with no real rules. One day, we found something new. We had gone deeper than usual, hiking further than we had before, over hills and through ravines that took us hours to navigate. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. The deeper we went, the less we recognized, until finally, we came across something that made both of us freeze. It was a treehouse. It sat high in the branches of a massive oak, at least 30 feet up. It wasn't a rickety kid's fort either. It was solid, built with real lumber, with walls, a roof, and even a little deck with a railing. It looked like it had been there for years. We were ecstatic. It was like finding a castle in the woods, a hidden base, a place that was ours. We ran all the way home, too excited to sit still, bursting to tell my dad about it. He just laughed and told us to be careful, but he did take us back to the surplus store to get some supplies. We bought rope and a few other things to help us get up there. Over dinner, we couldn't stop talking about it, planning how we would climb it, what we would do once we got inside. The next morning, we set out before dawn, loaded down with rope, knives on our belts, and more excitement than we knew what to do with. The hike felt longer than it had the first time, but when we finally reached the treehouse, it was just as amazing as we remembered. We spent hours making a rope ladder, tying thick branches to the rope, and testing each rung to make sure it would hold our weight. The sun was high by the time we finished, and our hands were raw from the work. But it was worth it. Finally, we climbed up. The deck creaked under our weight, but it held. From up there, we could see the forest stretching out in every direction, endless and green. We felt like kings. We played rock, paper, scissors to see who would go inside first. Alex won. He grinned, pushed open the door, and stepped in. And then he stepped right back out. His face had gone pale. He didn't say anything, just turned and started climbing down as fast as he could. I didn't understand. I stepped inside. At first, I didn't see it. It was dim, just slivers of light coming through the cracks in the walls. But as my eyes adjusted, I started to notice. The walls were covered, every inch. Not with drawings, not with old comics or maps, but with pictures. Photographs, magazine clippings, Polaroids, all pinned up in neat rows. And they were all of kids. Not just any kids. Naked kids. I felt sick. My stomach twisted, my throat closed up. I didn't understand what I was looking at, not fully, but I knew it was wrong. I turned and ran. Alex was already halfway down the rope ladder. I followed, moving so fast I almost lost my grip. As soon as my feet hit the ground, we ran. We didn't stop, didn't speak, just tore through the woods, crashing through the underbrush, our legs burning, our lungs gasping for air. By the time we got home, we were shaking. We told my dad everything. He didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone and called the cops. A patrol car showed up within the hour. The officer who got out was older, with a thick mustache and a heavy belt. He listened as we told him what we had found. He asked us questions. A lot of questions. Too many. How far was it? How did we get inside? Where did we buy the rope? Did we take anything from the walls? Did we touch anything? His voice got sharper as he went on. Less curious. More suspicious. My dad didn't like it. He cut the conversation short, told the cop to handle it, and sent him on his way. After that, everything changed. We weren't allowed to camp in the woods anymore. We had to check in every hour when we went out, which meant we couldn't go nearly as far. My dad even helped us set up a makeshift communication line using a tin can phone so we could call home from deeper in the woods. But the adventure was over. We never saw another cop. No one followed up. No one told us what they found. A year or two later, I was hanging out at a different park when that same cop stopped me. I was smoking, had a joint in my pocket, and figured I was in trouble. But he didn't do anything. Just looked at me for a long time, then told me to stay out of trouble and walked away. Alex was with me. He He asked about the treehouse. The cop didn't answer. Years passed. I went to college. Moved on. Then one day, I got an email from Alex. He had read something in the paper. That cop, the one who had questioned us, the one who had taken our report, had shot himself with his service revolver. His wife had found out he was circulating child pornography. My stomach turned as I read the email. Had we found his stash? Was that why he had been so weird? Had he known exactly what we had stumbled onto? A few months later, Alex sent me another email. He had gone to the cop's estate auction, just out of curiosity. One of the items for sale was a rope ladder and a bag. I never asked what was inside, and I never went back to those woods again. I was a strange teenager. I had this thing where I would take long walks in the middle of the night, alone, in places with no lights. It started as a way to challenge myself, to prove that I wasn't afraid of the dark. I figured if I could walk through pitch-black forests, then I could handle anything. The logic wasn't perfect, but it made sense to me at the time. It became a routine. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, I would head out, no flashlight, no phone light, just me and the darkness. I loved the feeling of it. The silence. The way the trees felt bigger when you couldn't see them. How the world felt empty, like I was the only one in it. My heart would race every time I stepped onto the trails, but after a while, I would settle into the rhythm of my footsteps, and the fear would turn into something else, exhilaration maybe. A kind of high. When I got home, I always felt amazing, like I had conquered something. That night was no different. It was cold, the kind of cold that made the air feel sharp in your lungs. The sky was clear, but the trees swallowed up most of the light. I had walked this trail plenty of times before, a narrow dirt path that twisted through the woods behind my neighborhood. It was an old trail, barely maintained, mostly used by deer and the occasional hiker. At night, it felt like stepping into another world. I moved carefully, keeping my steps quiet, listening to the sounds around me. The wind moving through the branches. The rustle of something small in the underbrush. A distant owl. The occasional creak of trees shifting in the wind. Normal forest sounds. Nothing to be afraid of. I don't know how long I had been walking when it happened. I wasn't paying attention to the time. I was deep enough into the woods that I couldn't see any lights from the houses anymore. Just black trees against a blacker sky. My eyes had adjusted well enough that I could make out shapes, the path beneath me, the rough outlines of the trees. But it was still dark, really dark. Then out of nowhere, I walked right into someone. I didn't see him. Not until the last second. One moment, I was alone, and the next, there was a figure right in front of me. A solid shape emerging from the dark. My brain didn't even process what I was seeing. My body reacted before I could think. I screamed. Not a controlled yell, not something tough or brave, just a full-on panicked, gut-deep scream. My instincts took over. I turned and ran. The second I moved, I heard it, footsteps behind me. Whoever it was, they were running too. My heart slammed against my ribs. My legs burned as I pushed myself faster, barely seeing the path in front of me. Branches whipped against my face. My breath came in short gasps. I wasn't thinking, wasn't planning, just running. The footsteps were close. Too close. For a few terrible moments, I was sure I wasn't fast enough. I was just waiting for a hand to grab me, to yank me down, for something horrible to happen. My mind went to the worst possible places. This was it. This was how I died. But then, something changed. The footsteps started to fade. Whoever was behind me wasn't keeping up. I didn't slow down. I didn't turn around. I just ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, lungs burning, legs screaming, sprinting down the trail like an animal being chased. I had no idea where the other person was. I could still hear them, but the sound was getting fainter. Maybe they had stopped. Maybe they had given up. Maybe they had never been chasing me at all. I didn't care. I didn't stop. I ran all the way back to the edge of the forest, back to the first streetlight, back to where I could see houses and porch lights and driveways. I ran until my legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air, heart pounding so hard it hurt. I sat there for a long time, staring back at the dark trail. Nothing moved. The forest was still. I told myself I had imagined it. That maybe I had just scared someone as much as they had scared me. Maybe they had just been out for a walk like I was. Maybe it had been a park ranger, or a hunter, or just another person who liked the dark. But at the time, none of that mattered. All I knew was that I was never walking in the woods at night again. And I never did. I've always had a fascination with caves. Something about their darkness, their silence, their sheer indifference to human life. It drew me in. I wasn't an expert caver, but I had enough experience to know the basics. Never go alone, bring multiple sources of light, mark your exits, and most importantly, always respect the cave. It doesn't care if you make it out or not. A few years ago, my friend Dave and I decided to push further into a nearby limestone cave than I'd ever gone before. I had visited this cave a few times, but only the more accessible areas, the large entrance chamber, the wide tunnels that let you stand upright, the paths that most people would dare to take. But I had read about a waterfall deep inside, supposedly leading to an expansive chamber beyond. It sounded incredible, and I wanted to see it for myself. We packed light but efficiently: helmets, headlamps, extra batteries, knee pads, gloves, and 2 ropes. Neither of us owned professional caving gear, but we had what we needed to move carefully. We also packed some energy bars and water, though we planned to be out before dark. The cave's entrance was familiar, a massive mouth of stone that swallowed the light as we stepped inside. At first, the air was warm, the dampness thick, but as we moved deeper, it cooled. The walls narrowed, and soon we reached the point where most people turned back. From here, we had to navigate tighter passages. We moved carefully, always making sure one of us stayed at a higher level in case we needed to toss a rope down. The first major obstacle was a tight vertical squeeze, like trying to slide from the front seat to the back of a compact car, except straight down. It took some maneuvering, but we both made it. Beyond that was a tunnel, wide but low. The only way through was to crawl on our stomachs, dragging our packs behind us. The space pressed down on my back, forcing shallow breaths. Every movement stirred up dust and the faint smell of wet rock. It felt longer than it probably was, maybe 10 or 15 meters, but by the time we emerged, my elbows and knees ached. We entered a small chamber where we could finally stand. The relief was immediate but short-lived. Ahead of us was another tunnel, about 2 meters wide, but just as low as the last one. We named it the Coffin Crawl as a joke, though the name would feel a little too fitting later. Moving single file, we pushed forward. The tunnel stretched on, and the further we crawled, the more it narrowed, subtly at first, barely noticeable, until turning around was no longer an option. If we had to go back, we'd have to crawl in reverse, which was not a comforting thought. Eventually, we saw a small opening ahead, a cramped space about the size of a coat closet. It was a relief to reach a point where we could at least sit up and catch our breath. But right before it, the passage narrowed to the tightest squeeze yet. I had to place one arm forward and drag the other behind me to fit. My ribs scraped the rock, and for a brief moment, I felt the first real pang of panic. I was stuck, just for a second, but it was enough to send a surge of adrenaline through me. I exhaled, wiggled forward, and made it through. The small chamber had a single stalagmite in the center. I flicked my light around the walls and saw several small, sleeping bats clinging to the ceiling. Not unusual. What was unusual was how, the moment we disturbed the air, the bats woke up. It started with one, then another, then all of them. Their tiny wings fluttered in the tight space, filling the air with a soft, rapid beating. They flew past us, brushing against my helmet, my arms, my face. The sensation was unbearable, not painful, just overwhelming in a way that made my skin crawl. There was nowhere to go, no way to duck, no way to escape. I could only keep my head down and let them pass. By the time they were gone, I was shaking. I took a deep breath, steadied my hands, and shone my light forward. That's when I saw it. On the stalagmite in the center of the chamber, a small torn corner of notebook paper sat wedged in the rock. The handwriting was clear, written in blue ink. Nothing here. That was it. Just 2 words. I stared at it, heart still racing, trying to make sense of why it was there. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. Someone had taken the time to leave this note in a place almost no one would reach. I had expected to find something, maybe the rumored waterfall, maybe just another tunnel leading deeper. But instead, someone had been here before us. And their only message was this. A joke, a warning, a message to themselves. I didn't know, but suddenly, the cave felt smaller. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever left this note had come in, written it, and left. But had they? The idea of someone else, somewhere deeper in the cave, leaving cryptic notes, unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I wanted out. Dave must have felt the same, because neither of us spoke. We just turned around and started crawling back. The way out felt longer, more difficult. I could feel the weight of the rock pressing down on me, squeezing tighter, even though I knew it was just my imagination. Every scrape of my clothing against stone made me flinch. We crawled, back through the coffin crawl, back through the tunnel that had felt easy going in, but felt suffocating on the way out. My arms burned from dragging myself backward. My knees throbbed. My breath felt too loud, too fast. When we finally reached the larger chamber where we could stand, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. We moved quickly after that, barely stopping. The familiar parts of the cave were a blur, and the moment we saw natural light filtering through the entrance, I almost laughed from the relief. Outside, the air was fresh, warm, open. We didn't say much on the way back to the car, and we never spoke about going back. Later, I tried to find any record of the waterfall or the chamber beyond, but there was nothing. No photos, no accounts, no maps. Just vague mentions in caving forums, stories that all ended the same way. People looking, people not finding it. And now, somewhere deep inside that cave, there was a note sitting on a stalagmite. Nothing here. I never believed in bad omens until the day my truck died in the middle of nowhere. It was late September, the air just starting to cool, when I took an old service road through a remote section of Wyoming. It wasn't the kind of road people traveled unless they had a reason, mostly hunters, ranchers, or the occasional lost tourist who missed a turn 100 miles back. I wasn't any of those things. I just liked driving places that felt empty, places where the land stretched forever and there wasn't a single sign of life for miles. It made the world feel big again. The road was rough, more like two tire tracks cutting through open land than an actual road. I had been driving for over an hour when my truck's engine sputtered once and died. No warning, no strange noises, just dead. I sat there for a moment, listening to the sudden silence. No wind, no birds, not even the distant hum of an airplane overhead. I turned the key. Nothing. The dashboard lights flickered for a second, then went dark. I wasn't worried yet. My truck was old, and I'd had trouble before. Probably just a loose connection or a bad sensor. I grabbed my phone to check for service. No signal. That was expected. I hadn't seen a single cell tower for at least 50 miles. I popped the hood, checked the battery, the fuses, nothing obvious. The engine just wouldn't turn over. Still, I wasn't panicking. The sun was high, and I had plenty of water. Worst case, I'd wait until dark when the air was cooler and hike back toward the highway. But I didn't want to do that unless I had to. So instead, I decided to look around. The landscape was flat, broken only by dry grass and the occasional twisted tree. In the distance, I spotted what looked like an old structure. Maybe an old ranger station. Maybe an abandoned cabin. Either way, it was my best shot at shelter until I figured out my next move. I grabbed my flashlight, just in case, and started walking. The building was farther than it looked. By the time I got there, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, stretching long shadows across the ground. Up close, the cabin was in rough shape. The walls were gray, stripped of paint by years of wind and sun. The roof sagged on one side, and what used to be a front door was nothing more than a jagged opening. I stepped inside. The interior was small, just a single room with a wood-burning stove, a broken chair, and a sleeping bag tucked into the corner. That stopped me. The place looked abandoned, but someone had been here recently. The bag was unzipped, the fabric still puffed up like it had been used in the last day or two. I stepped closer and touched the stove. It was still warm. I turned and scanned the area around me. No cars, no tracks in the dirt, no sign of anyone. Whoever had been here must have left on foot. But why? And where were they now? I didn't like the feeling in my gut. The cabin was empty, but it didn't feel empty. The silence had weight to it. I decided to head back to my truck. The walk back felt longer. The sky had shifted to that deep orange glow that comes just before nightfall, and I picked up my pace. Then I saw the lights. My truck's hazard lights were blinking in the distance. My stomach nodded. I hadn't turned them on. At this distance, my truck should have been hidden behind the ridge I had climbed over. But there it was on flat ground, plain as day. My legs carried me faster. I wanted to get inside, lock the doors, and pretend none of this was happening. But when I got there, something was wrong. The truck was not where I left it. It looked the same, but the land around it was different. The tire tracks I had made earlier were gone. The dry grass, which had been flattened by my footsteps, stood untouched. I checked the ignition. Still dead. The hazards clicked on and off, but everything else was lifeless. I locked the doors and sat in silence, my breath loud in the still air. I hadn't imagined it. The truck had moved. I didn't know how. I didn't know why. I just knew I wasn't alone. The sky darkened, and the land became a sea of shadows. I gripped my flashlight and tried to think. Walking back to the highway in the dark was not an option. That left the cabin. But as I stared out at the horizon, something caught my eye. A light. Not a flashlight, not a fire, just a faint, steady glow in the distance. Right where the cabin had been. I swore under my breath. The cabin was abandoned. No electricity, no power. So why was it glowing? I didn't want to go back. But sitting in my dead truck all night didn't feel like a good idea either. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The walk felt different this time. The air was heavier, thicker. The glow ahead flickered as I moved, disappearing behind hills before reappearing. When I reached the spot, I stopped cold. The cabin was gone. Not burned. Not collapsed. Just gone. I stood there, heart hammering, trying to make sense of it. Had I taken a wrong turn? No, I had followed the same path. The land was the same. The twisted trees, the dry grass, the distant ridge. But the cabin was not here. My skin went cold. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back at my truck, gasping for air. The lights inside my truck were off. The hazards weren't blinking anymore. I reached for the door handle. It was locked. I hadn't locked it. A shiver ran down my spine. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking, and jammed one into the lock. The second I climbed inside, I locked the doors again. Something was out there. Something was wrong. I forced myself to breathe. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing. I would not sleep. The hours crawled. Every sound made my nerves jump. The wind felt too still. The land too empty. At some point, exhaustion started creeping in, but I fought it. Then, sometime past midnight, I saw movement. Far out, just beyond where my headlights reached. A figure. Standing. Watching. I clenched my jaw, refusing to move, refusing to breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I don't remember the rest of the night. I think my mind just shut down, refusing to process anything else. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself to step out. The land looked the same as before. Silent, still empty. I popped the hood of my truck one more time. This time, when I turned the key, the engine roared to life. I didn't question it. I didn't check my phone. I just drove. As I pulled back onto the main road, I glanced in my rearview mirror one last time. The cabin was back, right where it had been, as if it had never left. I did not stop. I kept driving, and I never went back. There are places deep in the wilderness where the land does not belong to us. I learned that lesson the hard way. I was hunting alone that fall, a last-minute trip into a stretch of national forest in Montana. I had planned for weeks, studied maps, checked weather reports, packed carefully. I wanted to be as deep as I could get, away from roads, trails, people. I drove up an old logging road until it became impassable, then hiked in another 10 miles. No sign of anyone. Just towering pines, golden aspens, and the endless silence of untouched land. I set up camp in a clearing near a narrow stream, pitched my tent, and got a fire going before dark. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The sun dipped behind the trees, and I sat by the fire, listening to the night settle in. I should have slept well. I was exactly where I wanted to be. But something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. The woods were quiet, but that wasn't unusual. Animals tend to keep their distance when a fire is burning. Still, I felt something. A weight in the air, an unease creeping along the edges of my thoughts. I chalked it up to first-night jitters, put out the fire, and crawled into my tent. That night, I dreamed of trees. Endless trees. And something watching me from within them. I woke early, shaking off the uneasy feeling, and got ready for the day. My plan was simple. Move slow, glass the ridges, track whatever sign I could find. The morning was perfect. Crisp air, golden light filtering through the trees, the distant call of a raven echoing through the hills. I moved carefully, taking my time. A few miles in, I found a fresh game trail cutting through the underbrush, the kind that hadn't been there long. Then I saw the tracks. At first, I thought they were elk. Large, deep, spaced far apart. But as I looked closer, something was wrong. The shape wasn't right. The front of the print looked almost human long, with what seemed like toes. But the back was elongated, tapering off like a hoof. It made no sense. I knelt down, running my fingers over the edges of the print. The ground was damp, and the track was deep. Whatever made it was heavy. A chill crawled up my spine. I had spent years tracking animals, learning their patterns, reading their movements in the dirt. I had never seen anything like this. I stood slowly and scanned the trees. Nothing. Just towering pines and tangled undergrowth. I told myself it was probably a distorted print, maybe two overlapping tracks, some trick of the terrain. Still, I moved carefully. Something about those tracks bothered me. By midday, I hadn't seen a single deer. Not even a distant shape moving through the trees. That wasn't normal. The forest was full of sign, fresh rubs on trees, tracks in the damp earth. But everything was still. I had the creeping feeling I was being watched. I stopped in a small clearing to eat, keeping my rifle across my lap. As I sat, I realized something else. There was no sound, no wind, no birds, no rustling in the brush. I had hunted deep woods before, and it was never this quiet. I finished eating quickly and got moving again, keeping my steps light, my senses sharp. The trees seemed closer than before, like the forest had shifted around me. By late afternoon, I had made a wide loop back toward camp. I was moving along a steep ridge when I saw movement below. I froze. About 100 yards down the slope, half hidden in the trees, stood a figure. At first, I thought it was another hunter. But something was wrong. The figure was too tall, its limbs too long. It stood motionless, almost blending into the trunks around it. A trick of the light. A burnt tree? I raised my rifle scope and looked through it. My stomach tightened. The figure had no face. Just darkness where features should have been. My pulse pounded in my ears. I lowered the rifle, blinked hard, and looked again. Gone. The trees stood empty. But I felt it. I knew it was still there. Watching, I forced myself to move, keeping a steady pace back to camp. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long across the forest floor. When I reached my campsite, I stopped cold. Something was wrong. My tent was still there. My gear was untouched. But my fire pit was gone. Not disturbed. Not scattered. Gone. Like it had never been there. The ground where it had burned the night before was smooth, untouched, covered in pine needles. A deep, gut-level fear settled into me. Something was messing with me. Something that shouldn't be here. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my gear, shoved it into my pack, and slung my rifle over my shoulder. I needed to leave. Now. I started moving fast, almost running. The forest closed in, the trees pressing closer. I was miles from my truck, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. Then, ahead on the trail, I saw them. The same tracks. Long, heavy. Wrong. Leading directly to my camp. I swallowed hard and pushed forward. The silence was crushing. The air felt thick, heavy. Then I heard it. A single branch snapping. Close. Too close. I turned, heart hammering, and saw nothing. The trees stood still. The underbrush didn't move. But I knew. I knew something was there. Waiting. Watching. Hunting. I moved fast, ignoring the burn in my legs, the weight of my pack dragging me down. The trees blurred around me. I wasn't thinking anymore. Just running. Then, the forest ended. I stumbled onto the logging road, gasping for air. My truck sat where I left it, dusty and real and solid. I didn't stop. I threw my gear into the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. The key turned. The engine roared to life. I hit the gas, gravel spitting behind me as I tore down the road. I didn't look back. Not until I was miles away, back on the main highway. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. Days later, back home, I spread out my gear to clean it. That's when I found it, tucked into the folds of my tent, nearly hidden in the fabric. A single pine needle, long dark, twisted in a way that didn't look natural. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up. The moment I touched it, a deep chill ran through me. I threw it away, packed up my gear, and made a promise to myself. I would never go back there. Somewhere in those trees, something was watching. Something was waiting, and I was never meant to leave. Some places are not meant to be mapped. Some places do not want you to leave. I learned this the hard way. It started as a simple hiking trip. I was between jobs, tired of the city, needing space to clear my head. I picked a forested area in northern Idaho, a stretch of wilderness I had never visited but had read about. Miles of untouched land, barely any marked trails. Perfect. I packed light but smart, tent, sleeping bag, a few days' worth of food, water, a compass, my phone. I wasn't worried about getting lost. I had hiked all my life, and I was careful. My plan was to hike deep into the forest, find a quiet place to camp for a few nights, and enjoy the solitude. Just me and the trees. I parked at a small trailhead in the late morning. There were no other cars. No sign of people. Exactly what I wanted. I set off. The first few hours were perfect. The air was crisp, the smell of pine thick in my lungs. The trail was narrow but well-worn, winding between towering trees. I walked at a steady pace, enjoying the quiet. Birds called from the branches. Squirrels darted through the underbrush. The forest felt alive, vibrant. By early afternoon, I reached a fork in the trail. My map showed that the main path looped back toward the trailhead. The other path, barely visible, led deeper. That's where I wanted to go. I stepped off the main trail and followed the faint path into the trees. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. At first, I barely noticed. The wind shifted. The birds stopped calling. The air felt heavier. An hour passed. Then another. The path twisted and narrowed. I was sweating now, my pack feeling heavier. The trees around me were taller than before, denser. The light filtering through the branches turned dim, grayish. I checked my phone. No signal. Expected. I checked my compass. The needle spun slowly, wobbling. That was wrong. I tapped it, held it flat. The needle drifted lazily in circles. That shouldn't have happened. But I wasn't worried. Not yet. I kept walking. I came to a small clearing where a river cut through the trees. That didn't make sense. I had studied the maps. There was no river here. But there it was, wide and dark, moving slow, the surface so smooth it looked almost solid. I crouched at the edge, staring at my reflection. The water didn't move. Not a ripple. Not a single insect buzzing over the surface. A dead river. A wrong river. I stood up quickly, my breath tight in my chest. I needed to go back. I turned around, retracing my steps. But something was wrong. The trees were closer than before. The branches lower, thicker. I walked faster, heart pounding. The path twisted, narrowed. I followed it, but it felt different. Had I taken a wrong turn? I stopped, took out my phone. No GPS. I pulled out my compass. The needle spun again. A wave of fear crawled up my spine. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Everything looked the same. Endless trunks. Endless shadows. I picked a direction and ran. I don't know how long I ran before I saw it. A cabin. It sat in a small clearing, tucked between the trees, old and gray, its wood worn and cracked. There were no roads. No trails. Just this cabin, in the middle of nowhere. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back. But I was lost. And if there was a cabin, maybe there was someone inside. I stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under my weight. The door was slightly open. I pushed it wider. Inside was empty. No furniture. No dust. No sign anyone had ever lived there. Just wooden walls and a dirt floor. Except, in the center of the room, there was a hole. A wide, black hole in the earth, perfectly round. No ladder. No steps. Just darkness. A cold wrongness seeped from it, making my skin prickle. I backed away, my pulse hammering. And then, a sound. A whisper from the hole. Not words. Just movement. A shifting sound, like something waking up. I turned and ran. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs screamed. The trees blurred past, the light fading. I should have reached the trail by now. I should have seen the river again. But the forest didn't end. The trees never thinned. The path never changed. I kept moving, my breath ragged. The air was too still. The ground too soft. Then, I saw something ahead. The cabin. I stopped so fast I almost fell. It was the same cabin. The same cracked wood. The same open door. The same hole waiting inside. A wave of cold terror rolled through me. I turned, ran in the opposite direction. The trees closed in. Branches scraped my arms. The air thickened. And then, the cabin. Again. Waiting. The forest didn't end. I stood there, shaking, staring at the open door. I couldn't keep running. The forest wasn't letting me leave. The only way forward was down. I stepped inside. The hole yawned before me, black and endless. I had no choice. I took a breath and jumped. I don't remember landing. I don't remember climbing out. I only remember waking up on the side of the road, miles from my truck, the sun rising over the trees. The forest was behind me, silent and still. I didn't question it. I didn't try to understand. I just got in my truck and drove. I never looked back. I never went hiking again. And I never, ever want to know what was waiting at the bottom of that hole. The summer of 2013 was particularly brutal in southern Oregon. The kind of heat that made the air feel thick, heavy, and inescapable. I was stationed at Kingsley Field Air National Guard Base in Klamath Falls, working as a security forces airman. It was a demanding job, and the weight of it, combined with the oppressive summer heat, made for long, exhausting days. My closest friend on base was Nick, another airman who shared my love for adventure. Whenever we had a free weekend, we'd hop into his old Jeep and head out into the wilderness, exploring the endless network of logging roads and forgotten trails that crisscrossed the deep forests of Oregon. On one of these weekends, we decided to drive as far as we could into the mountains. No real plan, just drive, turn onto whatever road seemed interesting, and see where we ended up. We packed light. A few bottles of water, some energy bars, a couple of knives, and a .45 pistol that Nick always carried when we were out in the woods. Not that we expected trouble, but it was more for peace of mind. The forest out here wasn't just home to deer and black bears. Mountain lions were known to stalk these remote areas. The roads were rough. Old logging trails that hadn't been maintained in years, rutted from rain and overgrown with weeds. We drove for hours, deeper into the wilderness, leaving behind any signs of civilization. No cell service, no road signs, nothing but the occasional rusted-out piece of machinery left behind by loggers decades ago. Around mid-afternoon, we came across a side road that looked barely used. It was just a dirt path, the trees on either side growing so close that their branches reached out over the road, creating a tunnel of green. Nick looked at me, eyebrows raised. "What do you think?" he asked. I shrugged. "Why not?" He turned onto the path, and the Jeep rumbled forward, branches scraping against the doors. It was slow going. The road was uneven, barely more than a deer trail in some spots. But something about it felt different. Not just overgrown, but forgotten. Like no one had been down here in a very long time. After another 20 minutes of driving, the path suddenly opened into a clearing. And there, at the edge of the tree line, stood a cabin. It was old. That much was clear right away. The wood was gray and weathered, the roof sagging in places. The windows were dark, covered in grime, and the front door hung slightly ajar. Nick killed the engine, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the cooling Jeep and the distant hum of cicadas. "No way," Nick muttered. "What the hell is this doing out here?" I had no answer. There were no signs of a driveway, no paths leading in or out, just this forgotten structure standing in the middle of the wilderness. "Think anyone lives here?" I asked. Nick shook his head. "Not in a long time." Still, we hesitated before getting out. There was something off about the place, a wrongness that neither of us could put into words. Eventually, curiosity won out. We stepped out of the Jeep, the soft dirt muffling our footsteps as we approached the cabin. Up close, the place was even worse than it had looked from the car. The wood was cracked and splintered, patches of moss clinging to the walls. The front door creaked open slightly as a breeze passed through, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Nick pulled his flashlight from the Jeep and shone it into the doorway. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing a small, one-room interior. A wooden table in the center, a rusted-out stove against the far wall, and a single, rotting mattress on the floor. "Looks abandoned," I said. Nick stepped inside first, sweeping the flashlight over the walls. I followed hesitantly, my skin prickling with unease. There was a smell, not overwhelming, but enough to make me pause. Something musty, damp, but underneath that, something else. Something rotten. Nick was already moving further inside, inspecting the table. There were papers scattered across it, brittle and yellowed with age. He picked one up and frowned. "Looks like letters?" I stepped closer and peered over his shoulder. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. Words scrawled in frantic strokes, some sentences unfinished. I hear them at night. Scratching. Moving in the trees. It's not the wind. It's never the wind. Nick and I exchanged uneasy glances. He flipped through a few more pages, each one filled with the same paranoid ramblings. They whisper when the sun goes down. I know they're watching. I swallowed. Maybe this guy just lost it out here alone. Nick nodded, but his expression was tense. Yeah, maybe. Then his flashlight beam landed on something near the far wall. A single chair, positioned in the corner, facing the door. The wood was worn, the seat slightly concave from years of use. But what sent a chill down my spine was the thick layer of dust surrounding it, except for the two clear, distinct footprints in front of it. Someone had been sitting there. Recently. I took a step back. Dude, I don't like this. Nick didn't answer right away. He was staring at the footprints, his jaw clenched. Then, slowly, he nodded. Yeah, let's get out of here. As we turned to leave, the wind picked up outside, slamming the half-open door against the frame. It startled both of us, and Nick's flashlight flickered as he spun around. The letters on the table rustled slightly. The old stove let out a faint creak. Then, from somewhere outside, a branch snapped. We froze. The sound hadn't come from the wind. It was deliberate. Nick switched off the flashlight, plunging us into darkness. I barely breathed, listening. Another snap. Closer this time. We weren't alone. Nick grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the door. We moved as quietly as we could, stepping onto the soft dirt outside. The Jeep was only 20 feet away, but it felt like a mile. Another sound. Not footsteps, but something heavy shifting in the underbrush. We reached the Jeep, and Nick fumbled with the keys. The silence stretched, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. Then, just as he got the door open, we heard it. A whisper. Right behind us. Low, breathy, unintelligible. But close. Too close. I didn't turn around. Neither did Nick. We threw ourselves into the Jeep, slamming the doors shut, just as something moved in the trees to our left. Nick started the engine, gunning it into reverse so fast the tires spun in the dirt. As we backed away, the headlights illuminated the edge of the tree line. And for just a moment, less than a second, I saw it. A figure standing among the trees. Not an animal. Not a trick of the light. A person. Tall, thin, dressed in dark, ragged clothing. Their face obscured by the shadows, but their posture wrong. Too stiff, too unnatural. Then we were gone, tearing down the overgrown road, branches slapping against the windshield. We didn't stop driving until we hit pavement, miles from that place. Neither of us spoke the entire way back to base. We never found out who or what was out there that day, and we never went back. It started as just another hike. I had always preferred going off-trail, finding my own way through the wilderness, rather than sticking to the well-worn paths used by other hikers. Something about being alone in nature, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds, gave me a sense of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. This time, I had ventured deep into the forest, further than I had ever gone before. The trees were tall and dense, their thick canopy filtering the sunlight and casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, the kind of scent that always made me feel far away from civilization. I had been walking for hours when I first saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The house was barely visible through the trees, its weathered wooden walls blending into the surroundings. But as I moved closer, it became unmistakable, an old, abandoned house standing alone in the middle of the forest. I stopped, my heart beating a little faster. There was no reason for a house to be here. There were no roads, no trails, nothing that suggested anyone had lived in this part of the woods for a long time. Yet here it was, hidden away like a forgotten secret. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, the soft earth giving slightly under my boots. The house was small, no more than a single-story structure with a slanted roof covered in patches of moss. The windows were dark, the glass so dirty that I couldn't see inside. The wooden door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed against it. Something about it felt wrong. I should have turned back. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and the scent of old wood. My footsteps stirred up small clouds of dirt as I stepped cautiously into the house. The room I entered was simple, a single wooden table, a few broken chairs, and an old stove against the far wall. Everything was coated in dust, untouched for years. But then I noticed the papers. They were scattered across the table, yellowed with age. Some were crumpled, others torn, but all covered in the same hurried, uneven handwriting. I picked one up and started reading. I hear them at night, scratching, moving in the trees. A chill ran down my spine. I flipped to another page. It's not the wind. It's never the wind. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. The words were frantic, scrawled as if written in a hurry. Another paper caught my eye. They whisper when the sun goes down. I know they're watching. I set the paper down, my hands slightly unsteady. The room felt colder now, the air heavier. I had this sudden, unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. I almost left then. I should have. But something pushed me forward, an irrational need to understand what had happened here. I saw a narrow wooden staircase leading up to what must have been a small attic or second floor. The steps creaked under my weight as I climbed, my breath shallow. At the top, I found a single door, slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The room was small, almost empty except for an old mattress on the floor. The window was broken, allowing a sliver of light to creep in, illuminating the dust swirling in the air. And then I saw the notebook. It lay open on the mattress, as if someone had been reading it just moments before. I hesitated before picking it up. The first few pages were more of the same. Paranoid writings about sounds in the night, unseen figures watching from the trees. But as I flipped further, the handwriting grew more erratic, the words almost illegible. I saw them. They are real. They are not human. My breath caught in my throat. The final entry was different. The handwriting was clearer, almost deliberate. If you are reading this, leave now. Do not look for me. Do not stay after dark. A loud creak echoed from downstairs. I froze. I wasn't alone. The house had been silent when I arrived. No animals scurrying in the walls, no wind rattling the structure. Just quiet, suffocating and absolute. Until now. I heard another sound, slow, deliberate footsteps on the wooden floor below. My pulse hammered in my ears. Someone was in the house. I placed the notebook down as quietly as I could, my hands trembling. I had to leave. Now. I moved toward the stairs, stepping carefully, trying to avoid making any noise. But the old wood betrayed me. A sharp creak beneath my foot. The footsteps below stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I held my breath, listening. Then movement. Faster this time. The sound of someone, or something, rushing toward the staircase. Panic surged through me. I bolted down the stairs, nearly slipping in my hurry. As I reached the bottom, I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. Just the outline of a figure standing in the doorway to another room. I didn't look. I didn't stop. I ran. The moment I burst out of the house, I felt like I could breathe again. The late afternoon sun was still shining through the trees, but the forest no longer felt welcoming. The shadows stretched longer, the silence deeper. I didn't slow down. I pushed through the underbrush, branches scratching against my arms as I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. After what felt like forever, I finally stopped, gasping for breath. I turned back, expecting to see something, someone, standing at the tree line watching. But there was nothing. The house was gone, hidden once again by the dense forest. Had I imagined it? The sounds, the footsteps, the figure in the doorway? No. I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had seen. I made my way back to the main trail as fast as I could, my nerves still on edge. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors the second I got inside. My hands were still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I sat there for a long time, staring out into the trees. Who had lived in that house? Who had written those notes? And more importantly, who or what had been in there with me? I never went back. I never tried to find that house again. But sometimes late at night, I still dream about it. And in those dreams, I hear whispers from the trees. I never should have taken that trail. I had been hiking alone for years, preferring the quiet of the wilderness over the noise of everyday life. There was something calming about being deep in the forest, where the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant calls of birds. I always took precautions, told people where I was going, carried enough supplies, stayed aware of my surroundings. But this time, none of that mattered. This time, something was out there with me. Something I never saw. Something that followed me. It was a late autumn afternoon when I set out. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The trail was an old one, barely used, winding deep into the mountains where few people ever went. That was what I wanted, solitude, an escape from everything. I had planned a 2-day hike, carrying only what I needed. My backpack was light, my map marked with a small clearing where I planned to set up camp for the night. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. The trail was narrow but clear, weaving through towering trees that blocked most of the sunlight. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Even the birds seemed distant. Then I noticed it. The first sign that something was wrong. The feeling of being watched. At first, I ignored it. The mind plays tricks, especially in places like this. Shadows shift, branches sway, the wind whispers through the trees. But as I walked, the feeling grew stronger. Every few steps, I had the urge to turn around, to check the trail behind me. Each time, there was nothing but trees and silence. I kept moving. Then I heard it. A sound, faint, distant, barely noticeable. Footsteps. Not mine. They came from somewhere behind me, hidden among the trees. The moment I stopped, they stopped too. I held my breath. Listened. Nothing. Just the trees, the wind, the empty trail. I shook it off, forced myself to keep walking. But the feeling wouldn't leave me. And neither did the sound. It stayed with me for miles. Always distant. Always just at the edge of hearing. Never too close, but never too far. I tested it. Stopped suddenly, listening. Silence. Started walking again. And after a few steps, there it was. Faint, deliberate. A second set of footsteps. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe, moving through the trees. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't random. This was following me. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun had begun to set. The light filtered through the trees in long, golden rays, stretching shadows across the ground. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to turn back, to leave before night fell. But I had hiked too far, and the thought of navigating the forest in the dark felt even worse. I forced myself to set up camp. I built a small fire, its flickering light barely holding back the growing darkness. I ate in silence, my ears straining for any sound beyond the crackling flames. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. Even the distant footsteps were gone. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. I didn't sleep. I tried close my eyes, forced my breathing to slow, but my body refused to relax. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Then, a sound. Not footsteps this time. Something else. A rustling. A shift in the underbrush. Something moving just beyond the fire's light. I sat up slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The trees were dark, their twisted shapes blending together. The fire cast flickering shadows, distorting everything. I squinted into the darkness. Nothing. Then another sound, closer. A branch snapping. Something was out there. Something was watching me. I stayed by the fire. It felt like the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. For hours, I sat there, barely breathing, waiting for whatever was out there to make a move. But it never did. Not fully. It stayed hidden, just beyond my sight. Just beyond the edge of the fire's reach. But I felt it. It was there. And it was waiting. When the first light of dawn touched the trees, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The night had passed. Whatever had been out there was gone. Or at least, I told myself it was. I packed quickly, my hands still shaking. I had to get out. I had to leave. As I stepped onto the trail, I glanced back once, just once, at the clearing behind me. And that was when I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh, circling my campsite. Closer than I ever realized. Someone had been there. Watching. Waiting. I never hiked alone again. I've always loved the solitude of the wilderness. There's something about being alone in the vastness of nature that brings me peace, a kind of quiet that city life can never provide. But after what happened last year, I don't think I'll ever hike alone again. I still don't know who, or what, was out there with me. But I know one thing for certain. I wasn't alone. It started as a simple solo hike, nothing I hadn't done before. I had planned a 3-day trek through a remote section of national forest, far from any well-known trails. It wasn't an official route, just an old logging road that had long since been abandoned. I had scouted it out on maps, saw that it led deep into the wilderness, untouched, unexplored. Exactly what I wanted. I packed light, just the essentials. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, a knife. Enough to get me through, but not so much that I'd be weighed down. The first day was uneventful. The air was crisp, the leaves just starting to turn gold and red. The path, though overgrown, was easy enough to follow. It felt good to be out there, away from everything, surrounded only by the sounds of wind and birds. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a stream and decided to set up camp. The silence was almost overwhelming, but in a way that I enjoyed. No people, no distractions, just the raw stillness of nature. I should have known then. I should have realized how wrong that silence was. I built a small fire, ate a quick meal, and stretched out inside my tent as the sun dipped below the trees. The night was cold, but peaceful. At first, sometime after midnight, I woke up. No reason, just that strange feeling you get sometimes when something isn't right. I lay still, listening. Nothing. Just the wind, the faint creak of trees swaying. Then I heard it. A sound. Faint. Distant. A branch snapping. It could have been an animal. A deer, maybe. A fox. But it was steady. Deliberate. Slow. Footsteps. I held my breath, straining my ears. One step. Another. Then silence. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Maybe more. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just my imagination, maybe a raccoon passing through. I forced myself to close my eyes. But sleep never came. The next morning, I pushed the thought aside and continued deeper into the forest. The trail grew rougher, less defined, winding through thick trees and tangled underbrush. By midday, I spotted something strange. A tree, its bark stripped away in deep, jagged cuts. Not from an animal. Not natural. The marks were too long, too precise. Like someone had dragged a blade across it, over and over. I stared at it for a long time, my gut twisting with something I couldn't quite place. A warning, maybe. Or something worse. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I found another clearing and set up camp. The air felt different now, heavy, like the forest itself was pressing in around me. I told myself I was imagining things. But then, as I was gathering firewood, I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh. Leading up to my campsite. And stopping. Just stopping. Like whoever made them had stood there, watching. Then vanished. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made my skin crawl. The wind in the trees. The crackling of the fire. And then, the footsteps. Soft at first. Distant. Then closer. I held my breath, heart hammering. The fire cast long shadows across the trees, flickering, shifting. I grabbed my knife, my fingers gripping the handle so tight they ached. Then, silence. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. But the feeling remained. That feeling of being watched. I forced myself to stay awake until dawn. The next morning, I made a decision. I was leaving. I packed quickly, barely touching my breakfast, and started back the way I came. My hands were shaking. My skin was cold, despite the morning sun. Something was out there. Something had followed me. And I wasn't going to wait around to find out what it was. I moved fast, almost running at times. The forest, once peaceful, now felt suffocating. Every shadow seemed too dark. Every tree, a place for something to hide. Then I noticed it. The footprints. Not ahead of me. Behind me. The same ones I had seen the night before. Like someone had been standing just beyond my campsite. Watching. Waiting. And now they were following me. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. I just kept moving, pushing forward, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The sun was sinking lower, and I knew I had to get out before dark. Then, just as the trees began to thin, the sound, louder this time, closer. I turned, knife in hand, eyes scanning the trees. Nothing. But the feeling, that awful, gut-wrenching certainty. I wasn't alone. I forced myself forward, nearly running now, branches slashing at my arms, my legs aching. And then, just as the last light of the sun vanished, I saw it. The road. My car. I didn't stop until I was inside, the doors locked, the engine roaring to life. Only then did I look back. The forest was still. Empty. But I knew. Somewhere in those trees. Something was there. Watching. Waiting. And it always would be. There's a kind of silence in the desert that you can't find anywhere else. It's not like the stillness of a forest, where the rustling of leaves and distant calls of wildlife remind you that life is all around. It's not like the quiet of an empty house, where the walls hold the echoes of past voices. The desert silence is something else entirely, heavy, pressing, like a weight on your chest. That was the first thing I noticed when I set off on my trip into the wastelands of Nevada. I had always been fascinated by places most people avoided. The deep forests, the abandoned towns, the roads that led nowhere. The desert had been calling to me for years, and I finally had the time to answer. I had planned a solo trip, just me, my Jeep, and the endless expanse of sand and rock. 3 days of driving, camping, and exploring old, forgotten trails. I told myself it was for the adventure. But deep down, I think I just wanted to be alone. The first day was uneventful. The sun was relentless, but I had prepared for that. Plenty of water, extra fuel, a sturdy tent. The road was rough, barely a road at all, just a thin, winding trail of tire tracks stretching into the horizon. I drove for miles without seeing another soul. The last town had been nearly 50 miles back, nothing more than a gas station and a handful of buildings clinging to life. Beyond that, there was only the desert, vast, empty, and endless. As the sun dipped lower, I found a spot to camp near the base of a rocky outcrop. It was the only real landmark in sight, a jagged cluster of stone rising from the sand like broken teeth. I pitched my tent, built a small fire, and sat back to watch the stars emerge. That was when I saw it, a flash of movement. Far out in the distance, barely visible against the last light of the sky. A shape, dark, shifting, moving across the sand. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. A coyote, maybe, or a trick of the heat. But something about it felt wrong. Something about it made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The next morning, I packed up and continued deeper into the desert. The road grew rougher, the land more desolate. Then I saw the first sign. Not a literal sign. There were no signs out here. Just a feeling. A wrongness. It started with the footprints. They weren't mine. They weren't animal tracks either. They were human, barefoot, leading away from the road and into the open desert. I stopped the Jeep and got out, staring at them. They were fresh, too fresh, and they led nowhere. The wind had already begun to erase them, but I could see enough to know that they didn't return. Whoever had made them had walked out into the sand, into the nothingness, and never come back. By midday, I reached an old, abandoned structure, a rusted-out trailer, half buried in the sand. It looked like it had been there for decades, left to rot under the unrelenting sun. I pulled over, curiosity getting the better of me. The door hung open, creaking in the wind. I stepped inside. Empty, but not untouched. There were signs of recent activity. A broken bottle, a tattered sleeping bag, and something else. A notebook. It was sitting on a small, rusted table, its pages curled and brittle. I picked it up, flipping through the first few pages. The writing was frantic. Messy. It's watching me. I see it at night. Always at night. No one believes me. The footprints disappear, but I know they're real. I frowned, my skin prickling with unease. I turned the page. The last entry was just a single sentence. If you find this, don't look for me. I closed the notebook. Something about the air felt different now. Heavier. I stepped outside, scanning the horizon. Nothing. Just the empty desert, stretching forever. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That evening, I set up camp again, this time farther from any landmarks. Just open space, nothing but sand and sky. I didn't light a fire. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I didn't want to be seen. The night was colder than before. The wind whispered across the dunes, carrying distant sounds that might have been voices. I told myself it was the wind. Then I heard the footsteps. Soft. Slow. Somewhere just beyond the edge of my vision. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. I waited. Nothing. Then, a shadow. Not close, but not far either. A figure, barely visible against the starlit sand. Standing still. Watching. I blinked, and it was gone. By the third day, I knew I had to leave. Something was wrong out here. Something I couldn't explain. I packed up before sunrise and started back. But the road was gone. I don't mean it had been covered by sand. I mean it was gone. The tracks I had followed in, my own tire marks, had vanished. There was nothing but smooth, untouched desert in every direction. I felt something tighten in my chest. I wasn't lost. I knew I wasn't lost. I had been following a straight path, and yet, everything had changed. I checked my GPS. No signal. I turned the Jeep in what I thought was the right direction and drove. Fast. Hours passed. No road. No landmarks. Just endless desert. Then, a figure in the distance. I slammed the brakes. The shape was small. Still. Sitting in the sand. I hesitated, then stepped out. As I got closer, my blood ran cold. It was a backpack. Mine. The one I had left at my first campsite 2 nights ago. I grabbed it with shaking hands. It was empty. And then I saw them. Footprints. Barefoot. Leading away. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared into the sand. Gone. Vanished. I ran back to the Jeep. I didn't stop driving until I saw power lines in the distance, a sign that civilization wasn't far. When I finally reached a highway, I pulled over, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I looked back. The desert stretched behind me, endless and empty. But I knew the truth. I wasn't supposed to leave. And I don't think the desert was done with me yet.